I'm Nicholas Bornois of Capital Inc., and I would like to welcome you to today's podcast in the series Riding the Waves of a Lifetime. This podcast series gives us the opportunity to discuss with maritime industry leaders who share with us career and life experiences, as well as their insight on the industry's direction, opportunities, and challenges. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss with Lasse Kristoffersen, an influential and outspoken industry leader, and I would like to thank WinGD for sponsoring today's podcast. Thank you, WinGD. Lasse is the group president and CEO, and also a partner and minority owner of the Torvald Klaveness group. He started his career with the group in 2007, heading up the business unit Klaveness Maritime Logistics. In September 2011, he was appointed Chief Executive Officer for the group and became the first company CEO from outside the Klaveness family. Now, prior to joining Torvald Klaveness, Lasse worked for 11 years for Detnoskia Veritas, DNV, in various positions, including 2 years in New York, starting up the Maritime Solutions Americas for DNV. In 2006, he became director of DNV's operation in Norway. So Lasse, besides his shipping involvement for the industry, he also has an institutional involvement with the industry. He is an executive, as I mentioned, and also a principal and an industrial statesman aiming to lead to help lead and drive change in the industry in the right direction. Lasse has a distinguished and I would say fascinating career as an executive and a principal and also as a statesman for the industry. Our discussion will include a brief trip down memory lane, then focus on today, and then we will look ahead. We will focus basically on three themes: sharing a few career and life experiences, then looking at Torvald Klaveness, and then topics that affect the broader shipping industry. It has been a pleasure to cooperate with Lasse on several of our forums, and I would like to thank him very much for his participation and support. So now let me invite him to join us and start our discussion. Lasse, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course, it's a great pleasure. So let's start our podcast. And the first question that I would like to ask you is, which I think is particularly relevant in your case, how did you decide to pursue a career in shipping? Has there been a family connection to the industry? How did it all start?
Yeah, no, there has not been any family connection to the industry, but I grew up outside Bergen on an island called Askøy, and I was watching the vessels coming in and out of Bergen harbor every day. So in a way, I've been connected to the sea. Always had a boat, and and my father was very much involved in the fishing or fishery industries and distribution of that. So I had a connection to the sea more than shipping, I would say, and that put me to study naval architecture in the Norwegian Technical University. So a bit of a coincidence, and no family ties, but I'm happy for the choice though.
And then how did you actually moving from studying into working in the industry?
I have found that life is full of small decisions turning into big turning points, and it was I joined DNV back in 1996, working first couple of years in the offshore side of the business with risk assessments, and then I realized that in the company we did a lot of advisory to the oil and gas industry that was not delivered to the shipping industry, and that was really where I had my interest. So quite quickly I turned my focus to the shipping industry, and ever since, I would say 2000, also in most of my time in DNV, I was focusing on ship owners and ports and charterers and the back then the risks associated with their operations. So I think it was probably there was some gravity in me pulling me back to shipping, because I was quite quickly finished with the oil and gas industry.
Very interesting. So can you share with us a few milestones in your career and maybe a couple of major challenges you encountered on the way?
Yeah, I think probably the most important decision gate in my life was when and where to study. And I remember I was accepted at the university, and I came home one afternoon, and my mother's welcomed me in the door and said, "Here's your ticket. You're going to Trondheim, by the way, tomorrow." So and that has really led me to a lot of my friends I have, to my wife actually, which I've met at university, and certainly also my career. So that's one very pivotal moment, I would say. Another one was when, in the middle of my career in DNV, as you said, when I was actually looking for somebody to set up the office in New York on Maritime Solutions. But then we realized that this was a good opportunity for a family to get abroad and have that experience. And that really opened my eyes to both the international arena to a larger extent, living abroad, and also to the wider shipping context, and certainly more into the finance side of shipping, which I was not that much involved with prior. So I think that those 2 years in New York, both privately and professionally, was truly shaping years. And then maybe the third key point, and then it was a coincidence that I came into Klaveness. That was typical headhunting session, and I didn't know much about the company, but I was here for a couple of years. And then in 2011, when the owners decided to separate parts in terms of the financial portfolio and the shipping portfolio, of course, taking up the position as a CEO in a company of this heritage and this spirit, that was a very big decision for me, and has shaped, I think, who I am and what I think today. So maybe those are the three milestones, and many of them are coincidences, and it's a question of jumping on the train when you see it coming.
You're very right. I think you made an excellent point. Life has big decisions, but also a lot of small decisions that lead to big steps.
Yes,
exactly. You're very right. Now, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, you have an involvement with the industry at the helm of a major shipping organization, but you also have served as president of the Norwegian Shipowners Association for 2 years. So you have had an institutional involvement with the industry. So can you share with us your experience being at the helm of that organization, and also major initiatives that you undertook within the organization?
Well, first of all, I think it's a big honor to be promoted to such a role, and in a way be the spokesperson for the Norwegian industry, shipping industry, and to see how strong a position we have in the world. I think there are not many countries that have a more diverse and complete cluster on the shipping side than Norway, and in a way the Norwegian Shipowners Association is the front of that cluster, I would say. So politically, both in Norway and internationally, it gives you a lot of opportunities and opens a lot of doors to actually influence the framing conditions for industry. Very specifically for me, when I took up that president position, I decided I really want to make a difference on decarbonization and climate change. I had the clear sense that this was something that was becoming urgent, and our industry were not really taking into account how quickly the world around us were changing. So that was probably the subject I spent most time on, both internally but also externally, nationally and internationally. And I'm very proud that the last thing we did on my last day in service on the General Assembly, we approved the climate strategy of the association, which was, at least back then, I would say the most progressive one in the world, and with having zero by 2050, scaling zero emission vessels by 2030, price on carbon, a lot of these things that now are common goods, but a couple of years ago that was not the given. So I hope and believe that the Norwegian Shipowners Association really has been a shaper of that thinking globally. And if I played a small part in that, that was my objective with the whole. role.
Very interesting. And we will have the chance to dive into all these topics in more detail as our discussion continues. So let me focus a little bit on the group, on the Torvald Klaveness group. I see on the logo behind you, 75 years.
Yes.
Celebrating. So you joined the
It
group.
all started in New York, actually.
Really?
Yes. It started with, the old Torvald Klaveness, the founder. He had been part of what was called Nortra Ship, which was basically the Norwegian fleet controlled by the government during the Second World War. And he came out of that with a lot of experience and with an idea to become a ship owner. And he talked to a guy called Henry Mercer, who was owning the States Marine Group. And the start of Torvald Klaveness was actually that they become mentor and mentee, and Torvald started to provide him with Norwegian seafarers. And eventually that evolved into Torvald Klaveness. So the very start of it was actually in New York in 1946.
Very interesting. And thank you for this, looking back in history. But now let's also look at the 11 years that you have been with the group. You took it through, I think, quite development and transformation. Maybe you can take us briefly through the development of the group and its current operations.
Yeah, let me start with this. I think we have seen 75 years of pioneering in the industry. And in Klaveness, we have quite a few stories we're quite proud of. And again, one of them actually related also to New York. But one of the things Klaveness has been good at is to come up with new technology on the vessels, enabling deep sea freight. One of them on cement. So Klaveness was the first company in the world transporting cement in bulk, not in bags, reducing the logistics cost and making export of cement from Norway, for instance, possible, and into New York, and ending up with Klaveness and Norcem, the cement producer, having, I think, 30–40% of the US market at some point. So if you put your hand on something which is built in New York in the 50s, 60s, 70s, I can guarantee you your hand will touch some cement that's been on our vessels. And we have many more of those examples. But what I realized when I took over was that time for competitive advantage on a vessel technology level was hard. And there was so much commoditization and standardization that most vessels were alike. So we had to think through, where can we really create value? So in the first few years in my role, we sold off some businesses, actually cement being one of them. We sold off our cell phone loaders and other things to allow us to have the capacity to invest into new areas. And as of 2014, we had kind of set the platform, and we're able to invest in what we believed in. And that has very much focused around digitalization and decarbonization. And all the businesses we have in Klaveness today are having that as their fundamental business idea and value creation mechanism. And to just briefly take you through the portfolio, we have Klaveness Combination Carriers, a listed company in Oslo, the world's largest provider of combination carriers, being both tankers and bulkers, providing the industry with 30–40% lower carbon emission than the competition, and also, luckily, the owners with very nice returns due to high utilization. Then we have the Klaveness dry bulk business, where we are a big operator of Panamax vessels. We are a big commercial manager through our pools. And we're also delivering research services to the industry. So we are running a total fleet of 70–80 Panamax vessels in the dry bulk space. And then we have Klaveness Digital, who have a software as a service solution for the industry on logistics. We have Klaveness Ship Management, running technical ship management and projects. And finally, the last kid on the block, Zero Lab, working with new business models in decarbonization. So today the company consists, I would say, of 5 key building blocks, but all of them working on the subjects of decarbonization and digitalization.
Thank you very much. And we put, my team and I put some time into researching not only the group, but also positions you have taken yourself for the industry. So let me take the opportunity to focus on a few of those topics that you just raised. So let's start, for example, with the Klaveness combination carriers, which I think is a fascinating concept. As you mentioned, you have a fleet of 17 vessels which can carry both dry and wet cargo. And
Yes.
furthermore, these vessels have a unique environmental footprint. So how did you come up with this concept of combination carriers? And is this something that can be replicated widely in the industry? Is it economical? And what kind of trade do they serve?
Yeah, very good and long question. I'll see if I can answer it not too extensively. But I mean, the background goes way back. We are now on generation 8 and 9 of combination carriers. This was something that Klaveness started way back. And it started with the fact that we realized that we came into alumina refineries, and we were coming in empty and bringing the alumina out. So the starting point was to convert one small cargo hold to be able to carry wet caustic soda back in, I think, late 60s actually. And then we have been evolving with the aluminium industry, and that's truly been, I would say, the sandbox for us on this, where we've developed concept after concept. And the previous generation was Probos, they're now gone. And then we eventually came to the Cabus, caustic bulkers, and they are dedicated to the aluminium industry, and they bring wet caustic soda to the alumina refineries and bring dry cargo back to where we pick up the caustic soda, either from the Far East, or the Middle East, or the US Gulf. So the whole idea was focusing around bringing a cost-effective, low-carbon service to the aluminium industry. And we were quite successful with that, and we were expanding to 9 vessels, and that was more or less the size we could get to in that industry. So then 10 years ago, give or take, we were sitting down and saying, so how can we scale this concept, which is a unique concept where it basically, I mean, we earn 1.5 to 2 times the market on earnings. We have 30 to 40% lower carbon emissions, and we are always the cheapest provider of freight because of that. So we had actually several years of testing and discussing with customers, and that led us eventually to the CleanBu concept, which is now today 8 vessels that can carry, in addition to caustic soda on the wet side, also all clean petroleum products like diesel and gasoline and veg oils, and you have it. And then, of course, also dry bulk. So through that invention and developing that concept, we are going from a caustic soda market of 10-15 million tons globally to a CPP market of 1 billion tons globally. So now the market is not limiting our growth. And then you might ask, so why aren't everybody using building combination carriers? And I think I can tell you the reason why. Because I remember vividly, I was going to the big companies like the Shells and BPs and others back in 12 and 13 and 14. And we presented the ideas and we talked about decarbonization and cost effectiveness. And I said, fine, nice vessels, but we will never use them. In our policies, we say last 3 cargoes wet, so combination carriers not accepted. So it took really some, I would dare to say, boldness on our side to put $150 million forward privately to build the 3 first vessels, because we were so convinced that when we produce these vessels and show to them how well they perform, the industry will love them. And luckily we were right, but it took a lot of risk. And today, actually, those customers who told us we will never use them 5 and 10 years ago are today customers of the CleanBus. So I think there are quite some barriers to entry that trade, because it's very limited where you can trade them. But the core idea is to bring a wet cargo into a dry bulk loading area. And through that, we are able to have cargo on board 95% of the time and provide the efficiency that I just explained. And so far, customers are happy, and nobody have copied us yet. So we're still doing fine.
So your market has expanded in terms of the trade that you can employ them at. Out of curiosity, these sound like very sophisticated vessels. Where do you build them?
We built them at the Yangtze shipyard in China, the biggest private shipyard in China. And we had built a couple of series of vessels there before, and had a good cooperation with them. But I have to say that it was really a challenging task for both the yard and us to build something completely new. I mean, And for instance, just one element, I mean, on a tanker, you have, fully welded decks. On a bulker, you have open hatch covers. So how do you make a hatch cover that is truly not only liquid tight, but also gas tight on a vessel that constantly moves? So all of these things we have spent a lot of time and effort and developed actually our own solutions together with partners, and we're able now to provide a safe and effective solution.
And now another very interesting topic is, as you mentioned, these have a great environmental footprint. They can reduce carbon emissions by 30 to 40% compared to conventional ships. How can you achieve this? I mean, what do you do to?
I mean, let me just explain the very simple logic then of the dry bulk and wet tankers. And Australia is the world's largest exporter of dry bulk, and we do a lot of business there. So let me use that as one example. So if you are to pick up let's say a grain cargo on the east coast of Australia, and you just emptied your vessel in China, you will go in ballast down to Australia, pick up the cargo, and go back to China fully loaded and discharge. But the other dynamic happens on the wet side. So Australia is a big net importer of wet cargo. So a tanker go fully loaded down to Australia with, let's say, diesel to Melbourne, and then go empty back. And that means that they use the fuel both on the ballast leg and the loaded leg to provide that freight of that very wet cargo. But we bring cargo both ways. So we can basically distribute the fuel we use and the emissions we have on two cargoes instead of one. But then, of course, there's some trading. It's not an optimal trade, so that's why we say 30-40. Even in some trades, actually, we are on 50%, meaning that you remove ballasting in the equation of emissions.
Very interesting. So now let me move on to Klaveness Digital.
Yep.
You've been a pioneer in this space since you, I think, are the one who came up with the idea of Klaveness Digital in 2013. Based on the research we have done, no one in shipping spoke about digitalization during that time, as you have pointed out. And it's worth noting that in 2015, your team conducted a research across the internet and found that there were only 10 to 20 articles written on the topic of digitalization. Now, fast forward to 2019, this number, as you pointed out, had jumped to 20,000 plus articles. So with COVID-19 accelerating digitalization and technology, these are today, I think, major themes and buzzwords that we are hearing all over the place. So can you share with us your journey on finding this aha moment in digitalization and decarbonization? And how did these become the turning point in the shipping industry? And what led you to the founding of Digital?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because this is maybe the only aha moment I really had in my life, and it was a true aha moment. And let me give you a bit of context. I've always been interested in new technology, and I ordered my Tesla car long before it became a commercial object. It was just a concept back then. So thanks to that, I actually got delivered the first Tesla to come to any country outside the US. So the first 6 Teslas coming to Europe, I had one of them, and the others went to politicians and others who just got them basically for marketing. So I was actually driving my brand new Tesla with a lot of fuss down to a CEO summit where they discussed digitalization and disruptive technologies. Going back from that summit, sitting in my brand new Tesla with all the technology, I was thinking, damn, I'm in the wrong industry. I mean, nobody talks about digital and disruptive in shipping. It doesn't exist. And that's really what I want to work with. So in that car that day, I decided I have to change the industry and move to something else. And then eventually, as I was thinking of it, I figured out I was wrong. Actually, it was a big opportunity in shipping because nobody talked about it, but it will come. It's just a question of maturity. So during 2014, both personally and I spent a lot of time studying the subject, talking to a lot of people in the finance industry and others to understand what is this digital about and how does it change industries. And that led us to starting the digital team in 2015, where we tried different stuff. I brought in different consultants and others to help us, but it didn't work. But then eventually we found this team of 4 guys who had just sold their startup. They were in their late 20s. And we brought them in and said, do you want to join us in digitalizing the shipping industry? And so they did, and we tried a lot of different opportunities. We looked into transaction platforms, we looked into prediction models, we looked into performance modules for vessels, and eventually we realized the whole digitalization starts with the customers being digital on their supply chains. So we focused on developing this product called Cargo Value, which is today, I think it's fair to say, the leading logistics solution for seaborne trade. So our customers, being hydros and BHPs and others of the world, they use this to plan all their seagoing shipments, manage those shipments as they go on, optimize their port operations to, for instance, avoid congestion, and eventually they also have their online inventory management through that platform. So today I would say it's a fully fledged supply chain management solution for industrial companies, and it's growing quite fast. So we will most likely grow the revenue with 2 to 3 times this year compared to last. And we're today controlling, well, at the end of last year, we're controlling 5 times more cargo through a digital platform than through our vessels. So that's quite interesting. So we have much more digital than physical cargoes these days.
Very interesting. Well, I had a question that you answered partly already. I wanted to ask you how you marry technology and shipping into creating solutions that reduce costs, risks, and carbon emissions. And I was talking about the pioneering products that you're putting together. You already started along those lines. But besides the supply chain management, how do these have also an impact on carbon emissions?
Now, we have, when we approach digital in Klaveness, we do that on three areas. One is, how can we use technology to solve new problems for customers? And that's the cargo value I just described. Second is, how can we use data and analytical tools that we didn't have available 5-10 years ago to make better decisions on trading, on market forecasting, on optimizing vessel voyages, on optimizing trim, and all of these decisions all of us make every day. And on that we have done 2 things. We have basically made data available from our vessels, from our operations to the employees, but also invested heavily in training. So we have something called Klaveness Academy, and in 2019 we pushed all employees through a full training pack that we developed. Everything from new beginners to data scientists spent in average 2 hours a week retraining themselves on data and analytics, because we truly believe that we had to change the way we took decisions. And I'm very happy to see that has changed. And then, of course, lastly, we also use technology to digitize and automate and eventually robotize processes, for instance, on board, where we, over time, will have more and more autonomous vessels and less people attending the vessels, as most other companies are looking into. So I think this is very much about using technology to solve valuable problems. Digital is not a goal. Digital is a means for our customers or ourselves to make better decisions.
Very interesting. Now, researching, some of your statements in the past, I have the following question for you. We are now seeing the rise of a shared economy in consumers, where one does not need to own the asset. For example, using your own statement in the past, we stream music on Spotify today, whereas people used to buy CDs in the past. Or we use Uber to get us from point A to point B instead of buying a car. So how do you see Klaveness Digital offering this shared economy in the supply chain business?
No, I think this is at the core of what technology enables. It creates transparency and trust and enabling new ways of collaboration. And that's why I've used this Spotify example. And you can go even further back. I mean, back in the days, you had to physically go to a concert. And that was a little bit like US Steel owning their own mining operations and their own vessels, and we're fully integrated. And then moving that on to the second generation of business model in music, where you have the LPs and CDs and you brought your own inventory. Back then, the steel companies own their own fleet. But then eventually, today, no industrial companies own their own fleet. They just utilize the spot market, but they do it in the same way as they did in the analog age. Meaning that they have all these silos within their companies and between their companies on logistics. So we truly believe, and we can prove, and we actually facilitate companies that can cooperate and share logistics. And that's why we use this Spotify example, and that you should have logistics as a subscription, not as charter one-on-one vessel. And if you're an industrial company in the Middle East importing alumina to your smelter, you should just be able to buy that service from a digital provider and saying, give me this amount at that time, and you just fix it. And imagine that example, in the Middle East, you have 5 smelters buying more or less the same product from the same location on the same type of vessels. So that's not a competitive, element to it. And if we are able to make them subscribing to the same supply chain, they can make a decision every second day. A new vessel is coming into the Strait of the Gulf, and then they can decide who needs this vessel most. Instead of deciding 50 days earlier when they fix a vessel from China, going down to Australia, picking up the cargo. So it creates totally new opportunities for effective and flexible logistics if you're willing and able to share data and use a third party to orchestrate that. That's what we want to do.
Very interesting. Now, you used the phrase 5 years ago in your strategy plan that the future cannot be predicted, it can only be created. Very, very interesting statement. So where do you see Klaveness Digital in the next 5 years, and what future are you trying to create, and what problems are you trying to solve?
No, I mean, if you look at Klaveness in general on the digital arena, and that not only through the company Klaveness Digital, but also other parts of our businesses, but we have said that the ambition for our business and what the strategic position we want to take is to make seaborne supply chains resilient, decarbonized, and cost effective. And that means that the core of that service is the cargo value and the industrial company's ability to manage in a resilient way their logistics. Adding to that, they need to decarbonize their logistics. And that's where we have the Zero Lab coming in. That's where we have the KCC vessels coming in and others. That starts with measuring and eventually reducing your emissions. And we are working specifically on new digital services to help industrial companies to do that. And then the last but not the least one, which is cost effective, meaning how can you make sure that you use the markets the most effective? And what we do today is that we have invested a lot into data and research models and tools to optimize our trading. But what we now see is that through cloud solutions and cloud technology, we can mirror that to an industrial company and enable them to take much better chartering decisions and optimize their market exposure. So in the future, we believe that Klaveness to an industrial company is both a logistics manager, a carbon manager, and a market manager.
Quite unique. So let me ask you, you have Klaveness Digital, and then you have the Zero Lab by Klaveness. So what is the connection between the Zero Lab, and how do the two Zero Lab and the digital fit together?
Now, what we saw a year or two back was that there were a lot of focus on energy efficiency on the vessel level, but very few looked into what are the business models we need to create to enable industrial companies to decarbonize. And as you know, in the tramp business of dry bulk and tankers, there are no dedicated vessels to dedicated trades to dedicated customers as in the liner business. So that means for a company like, let's say, Alcoa, the world's biggest aluminum company, I think, if they are to decarbonize their supply chain because BMW tells them that we only buy zero emission aluminium, if they were to do that effectively, they would need to decarbonize more or less all vessels of the world, because through a year and through their operation, they will touch into so many vessels because they use the active tramp spot market. So what we believe is that somebody needs to orchestrate that market, so that a little bit like what's happening in the power market. And when you in your home, you can now go out and buy green credits for your power, and you can buy your power green. But that's not the electron coming to your house, because you can't control which electron comes to your house. It's just the right to say that that green power that was produced I'm entitled to claim the zero emission of it. Similarly, we need to disconnect the physical freight and the carbon credits within our industry. And in Klaveness, we call that insets. And we believe that that will start happening in what we call green corridors, where you will have a willing industrial company and an enabled shipping company, and also access to the fuel. And that's how you will start to decarbonize this industry, piece by piece, corridor by corridor, vessel by vessel, and we need to structure that and syndicate that into a market. So and that's the grand mission of Zero.
So you combine, as you said, the shipping, the cargo, and the fuel.
Yeah. And without owning or controlling any of them, creating a market where these meet, and where the most willing buyer of zero emission freight meets the most able provider of zero emission freight, without, let's say commercially, but not necessarily physically, because you can't dedicate a vessel to a specific trade.
Well, we'll talk later on about scope 3 emissions and scope 1 emissions and so on. So maybe that's a way to bring the two together in a way.
In a way, that's, yeah, yes.
So let me now turn to the broader industry questions, and let's focus on decarbonization. That is a key topic for the industry and also for Klaveness and yourself. And here, when we talk about decarbonization, traditionally we have three themes: who regulates the process, what are the fuels of the future, and who pays for it. So let's start with who regulates what. Should we opt for a global solution through the IMO? But at the same time, we have seen that now we have the risk of a lot of national or regional regulations coming into play. And what is your opinion is the best approach?
No, by far and without doubt, a solution to IMO is what we should aim for always. However, IMO is not an organization as such. It's a meeting place of nations. Nations who have different priorities, nations who have different abilities. So for IMO to move, all the members of IMO countries need to move. And it's just a fact that, let's say, EU is moving much faster today than some other regions. So the problem in IMO is, of course, that they simply don't agree on how fast and how. And that's why you will see these national and regional initiatives coming up, because EU says, we are happy with, we want global regulation, but if it doesn't happen, we will start. So I think it's not optimal, but it's the only, it's just natural when you are going into a transition like this, that when the world transition at different speed, it's really hard to get the global regulations right from the beginning. So personally, I've gone from being a skepticist to the EU ETS, where they basically put the shipping into their carbon trading and taxing system. I was skeptic to that, but now I'm actually positive. Why? Because I truly believe that the only way we can solve the decarbonization is to put a price on carbon. And now, following EU's initiative, it's not a question of if we have a price on carbon, because we will in EU. It's a question of where, who will regulate it, and who will benefit from that carbon tax. And that, I think, will change the dynamics of the discussions in IMO, because now countries cannot anymore say, we don't want the tax because it's here. It's a question of, do you want to regulate it globally? And do you want to have part of the proceeds coming out of that tax? So in a way, that's a long answer to your question, but I think eventually and ultimately, we need global solutions in shipping. But in transitions like this, we will take that in steps. And I think we as a society should be happy that somebody is running forward, because the rest of the world will catch up. I'm quite sure.
You know, one of the things that I have not been able to understand myself, and of course, you are a lot more involved with the industry than I am. The IMO is a consensus organization. Everybody wants the IMO to be the global regulator. At the same time, as we pointed out, we see regional initiatives coming out with more speed right now. We have the EU, maybe the US will come out with something, maybe China. Yes. So the question that I have is, when you see 2 or 3 regional initiatives spearheading, how do you then put everything to converge under the roof of the IMO? Or that's where I find it a little bit.
No, and you are right, and it is a challenge. And then of course, if you are waiting for the perfect, you will wait forever, right? So I think, in my view, it's much better that some regions do something to actually reduce carbon footprint, that everybody waits for the perfect solution. So that's one element. So I think we as an industry, whether we like it or not, and we can agree that we should have a global solution, we just need to prepare ourselves that this is going to be very challenging over the next decade. I think the 20s, you will see a lot of different schemes coming up with different ways to do it. And it's national and it's regional and so on. So that's number one. Having said that, I sense a shift in the speed of the consensus in IMO. I think even those countries who've been dead against any regulations on carbon has moved. Some of them being big ship-owning nations that just a few years ago said, we can't bring carbon out of shipping, it's carbon captive. Now supporting ICS going into the IMO meeting with, we need to get to 0 by 2050. We need to get a price on carbon. We need to scale zero emission vessels to at least 5% of the fleet by 2030. These things were unthinkable just a few years ago. So I'm also an optimist that the world is moving forward. We have specific proposals on the table in IMO for a global tax, and also IMO will be forced to update their strategy to get to 0 by 2050 as everybody else. So I think the world is moving in the right direction, but there's everything with the climate, not fast enough and not coordinated enough. So it's going to be a challenging decade, but the only thing I can tell for sure is that it will be more expensive to emit carbon for every year going forward.
Now, moving forward, regarding the objectives to be achieved, you have been critical of so-called toe-tipping ineffective measures, and you have stressed the need to push hard for the adoption of harder measures to bring about change. And you've stated that the IMO goals, at least at present, are a bit low. So what do you expect the IMO or the overall targets to be, and how can we help the industry move in that direction?
No, I think for IMO, first of all, IMO needs, as I said, to make sure they are relevant. And what is relevant? Well, that means they have to be within the framework of the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree goal. And that means that shipping cannot have a strategy of being down 50% in absolute emission by 2050. It just makes you irrelevant. And it's just naive to believe as an industry that we can decide when we want to decarbonize. The society decides. And eventually we will wake up in the 30s and see that we have to get to 0, so we can just get our act together now. So number one for IMO is to agree that we need to get to 0 latest by 2050. And second is that we don't have time for these mumbo jumbo small things. We actually need to make sure that latest by 2030, the only responsible financial choice you can make is to order a zero emission vessel. And that means that we only have 5 to 10 years to scale the technology, to scale the fuel, and make that business case viable. So we need to, in addition to the 2050, we need to get a price on carbon. We need to put a price on the stuff we don't want, so we can incentivize the stuff we want. And that is the third element of that legislation, is that we need to use the proceeds from such a carbon tax to neutralize the cost disadvantage of early movers. on the fuel and on the vessel. And also probably over time, support those countries who are disadvantaged by increased transportation costs. So I think it's quite clear what we need to do. And the bustling thing for me is that for the society as a whole, it hardly costs anything if we get it right. I mean, to decarbonize the shipping industry in total would have negligible effect on the consumer's cost of a TV or a car. We have the example in Klaveness that we can provide zero emission freight from South America to Europe on grains, and that would only increase the price of that bread in Europe by 0.5 cent. But the price of the freight will be 50 to 100% higher than the brown alternative today. So for an importer of grains in Europe, it's impossible. But if we're able to link the willingness at the consumer down to the business level through a price on carbon, it's not a big challenge for the society. So these are the mechanisms that we need to, make running. And that's why I spend quite some time in ICS and towards IMO, and I'm going to COP26 now to try to convince that we need to get moving. We are in a hurry.
Yeah, I saw your recent LinkedIn postings, indeed, and I wish you a great trip to COP26.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you're going to be quite vocal there in terms of stating your positions. But our discussion is based on the need for unity, concentration of effort, maybe to have some commonly accepted benchmarks and standards. But at the same time, we see a lot of well-meant initiatives by non-industry organizations, by charterers, financiers, a lot of well-meant initiatives. Now, how do you coordinate all these? I mean, do all these lead to more complexity? Do they add to the solution? How do you get everybody to work together and maybe create some common benchmarks?
Well, that's the $1 trillion question in everything in the world, I guess. And if we just agree that religion is not an enemy, it's a friend, and so on, we wouldn't have problem. But the reality of things is that when things change, different interests change at different speeds. So that you have organizations like initiatives like the Poseidon Principles, the Sea Cargo Charter, all of these initiatives coming out, is just because companies realize that they need to move faster than what the regulators are doing. So all these are just expressions that business is moving faster than politics and regulations. And when you have scenarios like this, you will see a multitude of initiatives. And that's always the starting of a transition. That is that the business is way ahead, and finance is ahead of business, and business ahead of regulators. So ideally, we should have one standard, one approach, one route. But to me, that's just naive to believe. It will be very complex the next decade to navigate this. So I think the only robust thing you can do is, one, if you save a ton of carbon, you improve your competitive advantage. And two, if you invest in increasing the competence on carbon and energy efficiency, you have probably the best return you can get. Because the world is changing, it's changing fast. It's not changing in a coordinated manner, unfortunately. And you can deny that and tell the world to change, or you can adapt and make it your competitive advantage. The latter is what we try to do in Klaveness.
We had a recent interview with Graham Henderson, who made a statement that I found fascinating. As you know, he is working under the Together in Safety coalition.
Yes.
And he said that we should establish something Together in Decarbonization coalition and get everybody under that umbrella. And then, you also had Mark O'Neill of Intermanager exactly voicing the need for more concentrated effort and coordination. So let's hope that this somehow will happen.
But let us not forget, we are as an industry very lucky. We have IMO, we have a global regulator. No other industries have a regulator like that. So we have the institutions in place.
Indeed.
I believe they will deliver eventually, but it will be some choppy seas before that.
So let's now turn to the fuels of the future. We see an increasing number of companies opting for LNG, but at the same time, there are so other fuels under testing out there. So how do you see the process evolving, and what could be the final outcome?
Yeah, if I knew, I I wouldn't be sitting here. So that's of course impossible to predict, and that's why we are focusing on shaping. But I think let me start with this perspective. If you think you can solve the carbon challenge with carbon, you're wrong. So to me, LNG is a sidetrack we cannot afford anymore. It's probably, from well to wake 15-20% better than fuel oil, but the times are behind us for when we could be looking at 10 and 20% improvements. So to build a whole new infrastructure globally over the next decades around LNG, if that happened 20 years ago, it probably would be fine. But today we simply don't have the time. We need to scale zero emission at the second half of this decade. So if you invest in an LNG propulsion today because of the energy efficiency in itself, I think we will be disappointed 10 years from now. But if you invest in LNG as a bridge to future zero emission fuels, you probably do something clever. So those are two different perspectives on LNG. When it comes to the fuel, we are convinced in Klaveness that ammonia will be the fuel of the industry. We don't know, but that's what we believe. Why do we believe that? Well, first of all, what's quite sure is that it will be hydrogen will be the atom that basically carries the energy of the future, not the carbon, but hydrogen. And hydrogen is then derived either from renewable energy or possibly from gas with carbon capture, so-called blue hydrogen. But I think eventually it will start with hydrogen. If you use hydrogen in its pure form as a gas or liquid, the energy density per weight and volume is more or less the same as lithium batteries. It doesn't work. So to give an example, the energy system will have the same weight as the whole vessel if we were to use lithium batteries or hydrogen gas on one of our vessels now. So it just doesn't scale on deep sea. So then you need to take that hydrogen on board in a different form. And you have two options. You can add CO2 into methanol and other e-fuels, or you can add nitrogen into fuel, and then it becomes ammonia. And to bring the logic very short, two main reasons why we believe in ammonia is that we believe it's going to be cheaper than e-methanol. But second, and more structurally, we don't believe that the society at large will put CO2 into a fuel and then release it afterwards in the future. If you have captured CO2, it will be so valuable that you will put it down and store it. So that's a main argument in my view for why e-methanol will not scale over the next decades, because it's not CO2 free. It actually emits CO2 and you insert CO2 into the hydrogen. And I think that CO2 rather should be stored than released.
Very interesting. So we've been discussing for an hour, so I have a few more questions for you. I'll try to speed them up so we don't prolong it too long, even though our discussion is so interesting. And the point of this podcast is not to have a quick run-of-the-mill discussion, but to really go into deep into the topics, and I appreciate your time. So let me ask you, one of the things that I found very interesting in your statements is that you recently called the Scope 3 emissions as the bastard child of the emission hierarchy. Now, for our listeners who may not be familiar with this, greenhouse gas emissions are categorized into three groups or scopes by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the widely used protocol.
Yes.
So Scope 1 covers direct emissions from owned or controlled sources, and I think that is for ships. Scope 2 covers indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating, or other cooling areas. And Scope 3 includes all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain. That includes purchased goods and services, business travel, and more. And I think Scope 3 is probably the biggest in terms of greenhouse emissions. So how
it depends on the perspective you have, but I think the interesting element here is that scope 1 for one part of the value chain is scope 3 for the other, right? So the vessel emissions are scope 1 for the ship owner, but scope 3 for the charterer. So in a way, if you have, again, used the Alcoa example, so Alcoa's scope 3 emissions are everything associated with the products they buy and the vessels they hire and the products they sell. So everything coming in and out basically of their factory. So in a way, scope 3 has not been really on the agenda for these industrial companies up until, again, we do this research on a number of articles. It's only this year that this has become a big topic. So if you asked a big industrial company 2 years ago, what are your emissions? They would tell you the scope 1 emissions, the emissions coming out of the smelter itself, probably also the scope 2 emissions, which are from the power station producing the power to make the smelter, but they won't measure scope 3. That is now coming. And that's really an opportunity for ship owners, because now the scope 1 of the ship owner and the scope 3 of the industrial company, that is now something that the industrial company is held responsible for. So for instance, back to my example on Alcoa, when BMW buys their, or Tesla buys their aluminium, they tell eventually Alcoa, we wanted zero carbon. And for Alcoa to make it zero carbon, it's not enough only to take carbon out of the production and the smelting, they also need to take it out of the supply chain. So that will eventually lead Alcoa to say, well, we need to decarbonize vessels as well. So that's why it's so important, the increased focus now on industrial companies on reporting of scope 3 is that they are held responsible for the emissions we as a shipping industry are doing. And that's why we will see industrial companies being willing to pay extra to reduce emissions.
In a way also that underscores and highlights the very important role of shipping as part of the supply chain.
The world cannot decarbonize if shipping does not decarbonize. There's not a single product you can hold, even your glasses, Nico, would need to have decarbonized shipping to be fully decarbonized. We are a part of every value chain all over the globe. 90% of the goods moved are moved on vessels. So there's not a single thing, more or less, in the world that can be fully decarbonized without shipping being decarbonized.
Very interesting. Thank you. So let me ask one last question on these topics on diversity. And I know that this has been a topic for the industry. And also I know that your group at Klaveness, we have done a number of initiatives in that direction. So can you share with us your insight on how, on this particular topic?
My starting point is not gender, but business, meaning that we are facing two fundamental transitions in our industry. One is digital, and the other one is decarbonization. And for us to be able to tackle that transition, we need access to all the talent we can.
Of course.
And our industry has, to a large extent, only tapped into half of the world's talents. That will not take us there. So what brought us to where we are will not bring us to where we want to be. So we need to get access to all the talent around. And also we need, when we are going through transitions, we need to do so in a representative way. So if minorities, being females or ethnic minorities, are not part of that process, it will not be a credible and equitable process. So I think for us to drive this industry through these transitions, we need to do so with a true diverse workforce, both from talent, from credibility, and simply just out of responsibility. We are here to create equal opportunities for people. And that's really something which is important to our industry. And I think we're doing better in some areas, but in particular on top executive levels and on commercial roles, there are still a long way to go to get in females. And one of the main reasons why we should have more female CEOs is that they should shape that role different from how these by men 50 plus in the past. the world is changing, and so the businesses have, and so also we need to think differently on who runs businesses. So to me, this is both a business and a responsibility matter.
You're absolutely right, and I think the way you coined it is even better. It's workforce diversity. It's not tied to a particular element, and I think giving the proper diversity gives you access to the whole talent pool, and the industry needs that. So
yes.
Well done, thank you. So last question. Today we have a low order book across several sectors, such as dry bulk and tankers. Environmental regulations, as we discussed, create uncertainty as to what types of ships to build. On the other hand, the industry focuses and needs younger and more efficient tonnage. So what does this mean for the supply-demand balance? And what does it mean for you as a ship owner who wants to place a fleet renewal order?
Headache. That's my first big headache. So I think to order a new vessel today without seeing a bridge to zero emission, I would say you are very bold, maybe even naive. Because in that life cycle of that vessel, let's say it's delivered in 25 and it lives maybe all the way up to 2050, we will change the energy platform of this industry. So it's really difficult and bold decisions to be made. And I'm sure that a lot of companies are like us, that they are still looking into how can we both be competitive in the short term, where carbon is the main fuel, but at the same time create energy platforms that can bring us on the same vessel into a zero emission. And I'm sure that slows down the pace of which vessels are ordered and will, for the short term, I think, mute the supply. Adding to that, the fact that we've had this boom in containers, booking up all the slots and driving prices, up, also reduces the financial incentive to order a vessel now. So, in a way, supply side in tankers and bulkers, you see quite a perfect cocktail of both high new building prices, limited slots available, and high technical risk, meaning that there's a quite muted interest in building vessel time being. So I think we are up for a muted supply side, and then let's just hope that the world keeps on developing and that demand side keeps up, and then we will have a couple of good years in our industry.
Lasse, we've been discussing for quite some time, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for your tremendous insight. It's always wonderful to speak with people who have not only insight, but also strong opinions and direction. Because at the end of the day, that's how things happen. When you have a plan, when you have a goal, an objective, and a direction to move towards. So really thank you for your insight. I'd like to thank also, again, WinGD for sponsoring today's podcast, and I will turn it over to you for some closing remarks before we go.
No, I think for young people today going into business life, to have an industry that will transform both the way we do business from analog to digital, and the way and the whole energy system that we use from carbon to zero emission, that must be the opportunity of generations. So I really, really encourage young, talented people to look at shipping as the industry that will see the biggest change in their career. So please join us.
Thank you very much, Lasse. Really great having you with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.